Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. After that, if you have a hubcap, remove that now. Once you have that out of the way, continue on to each of your 4 21mm lug nuts. Remove the 4 and then the wheel. Now let's move along to the back side of the caliper. We're going to be looking for 2 17mm headed bolts holding the bracket to the knuckle. Remove the pair. While you have it off, inspect your brake pads. If it looks like they're worn at an angle or they need to be replaced, now's a good time to do it. Aside from that, assuming it looks good, let's hang the caliper aside so it's putting no pressure on the flex hose. All right, let's grab onto the rotor and remove it. Have a look at the back side. You want to make sure that you clean the mating surface of the rotor along here and the mating surface of your wheel hub. Now let's move along to removing our tie rod end. Typically, you're going to find that you have a cotter pin. Take that out of there, use a 17mm, remove the nut, give this a couple loving bonks to break it free. This one's pretty rotted, so I'm just going to break it off. Now once you have the nut off of there, put it back on a couple good threads. We'll spray this area with some penetrant, let it sit, and then we'll give it those loving bonks. Inspect your tie rod end, make sure there's no damage. Now at this point, you can pivot the steering knuckle as needed. We'll continue on along the backside and remove this 14mm bolt. After you have it out of there, go ahead and give everything a little wiggle. We're trying to make sure we separate the brake flex hose and the ABS wire bracket from the backside of the strut. Now we can continue on with the ABS wire itself. Follow it over to where the mounting point is on the strut. You can either use a small screwdriver or a pick. Go ahead and separate this area. Now to do the ball joint, you don't necessarily have to remove the ABS sensor from the knuckle. Typically, you can just very carefully remove the knuckle and slip it up and hang it from the strut. For me personally, I'm going to be removing the ABS sensor. Once you have the bolt out of there, continue on with some penetrant. We'll give it a little wiggle and try to remove it from the knuckle. When you remove it, be extremely careful not to damage this area. That's the sensing agent. Now we can carefully set this aside, making sure we're putting no pressure on the line itself. At this point, we're ready to continue on to our axle nut. Looking at it, you can tell it's a 12 point. You want to use a 12-point 30mm socket. Continue on with a hammer and punch, come right in the center of the axle. We're going to carefully try to drive it out of the bearing. Once you know you've got plenty of movement, we can continue on up along the top here. To remove each of our mounting bolts, we're going to use 2 19mm. We'll use a wrench on one side and a socket on the other. It's a good idea to leave the top bolt in there and continue on to the lower. With both of the nuts off of there, we'll continue on by removing the bolts. As you remove them, keep in mind, this is going to want to swing down. When it swings down, you need to also be pressing the axle through the bearing. If you do not, you could potentially damage the axle. Now let's move down to where the ball joint connects onto the knuckle. Looking at it, you're going to find some sort of cotter pin. Remove the cotter pin and then the mounting nut. Once you have the cotter pin off of there, use a 19mm socket to remove your ball joint nut. Once you have it off of there, continue on by starting the nut on a few good threads. Now, you're going to have to separate the steering knuckle from the lower ball joint. When you do this, there's several ways of doing it. Commonly, people will use a pickle fork. They're going to come right in between this area and try to separate it. If you're not replacing the ball joint, you're going to ruin the boot, in which case, typically you have to replace the ball joint. Otherwise, if you happen to have a stud puller of some sort, you can go right over this, squeeze it down, and that should press the stud out and through the steering knuckle. We're going to be replacing the ball joint, so for me, I'll continue with a pickle fork. All right, now we can set this aside. Now that we have the knuckle out of the way, we're going to continue on by removing the ball joint boot. Go ahead and grab a screwdriver, whatever you might happen to have, and pop the boot out of the area. Once you have the boot off of there, continue on to cleaning off the grease from the ball joint. Once that's clean, continue by cutting off the stud of the ball joint so we can continue pressing the ball joint out of the lower control arm. Now that we have the stud off of there, let's continue on with our ball joint kit. You want to find a cup that can fit directly over the ball joint area along the bottom of the control arm. The reason why it needs to fit over it and not necessarily press against it is because we need to actually drive the ball joint down and out of the control arm. So you need to have something that's big enough to catch that. We'll take the rest of our ball joint press, line it up as center as possible, and start pressing the ball joint out. There's what's left to it. Now with the ball joint out of there, continue on with a brush of some sort. We need to make sure that we clean up the control arm where the brand new ball joint is going to go. Once you have it cleaned up, give it a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look rotted or damaged in any way. If it looks like it's rotted or weak, you have to go ahead and replace the entire control arm. Now it's time to move along to the new ball joint. We need to start preparing this for installation. Remove the mounting nut. We'll set that aside. The next thing you need to do is remove the protective boot. When you do it, you need to be extremely careful. To do this, if you were to look along the bottom of the boot where it connects onto the ball joint, you're going to find a metallic snap ring. We need to carefully loosen that and slide the boot up and off. Make sure you do not damage it because you will be reusing it. To remove the clip, you can either use a pick or a small screwdriver. We'll just carefully come underneath this area and gently start prying it out and away. Once the clip's off of the boot, slide the boot off of the ball joint. Once again, we're being extremely careful not to damage the boot. Give that boot a quick inspection. We'll set that aside. The next thing you want to do is fully remove that metallic clip. We'll give that a quick inspection and set that aside as well. Now we can get ready to install the lower ball joint into the control arm. Before we do, I want to show you the bottom of the ball joint. To press the ball joint into the lower control arm, you need to only press along the outer aspect of the ball joint. You cannot press along the center. You will damage your brand new ball joint. Let's carefully take that ball joint and we'll slide it in along the bottom of the control arm so the stud is facing up. Now we're going to take a cup that only fits along the outer aspect of the lower ball joint. Next, we're going to find a cup that fits over the ball joint and only hits up against the control arm. The upper cup cannot touch against the ball joint. It will damage it. Now we can grab our ball joint tool and we're going to start pressing the ball joint up and into the control arm. We want to make sure that the base bottoms out against the control arm itself. Make sure everything's as centered as possible. Once you feel as though it's properly centered, let's continue by driving this up and in. We're going to be paying attention to this area right here. Like I said, the base of the ball joint needs to hit up directly against the control arm, and it needs to be as flat and level as possible. Looking at this, I can tell that the ball joint's directly against the control arm. While still under pressure, continue with a hammer. Give the control arm a couple loving bonks just to cause some vibration to make sure it's completely seated properly. I'll give the tool a couple bonks as well. Carefully remove the tool. Once you have the tool out of the way, give it a thorough inspection. Once again, it's super important to make sure it's completely bottomed out against the control arm. While the boot is off, I like to add a little bit more lubricant along the joint area. That'll help keep moisture and debris away and make sure that the ball joint lasts for an extremely long time. Now that we have this lubed, let's continue on with our locking clip. For the locking clip, you want to make sure that you put it on the bottom groove, the one that's closest to the control arm. It's essentially a locking clip that prevents the ball joint from loosening up from the control arm. I'll use my snap ring pliers on the clip here, go inside each of the two ears, gently separate it and slide it down and into position on the control arm. Double check all the way around, make sure it's completely secured. Now it's time to install our protective boot. We'll slide this right on over the stud, and you want to make sure you get it down onto the groove of the ball joint. Let's press it right on there. I'll give it a little wiggle, work in some of that grease. As I start sliding the clip on, I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver and carefully push it down into the groove where it needs to be situated. Give the boot a tug, make sure it's secured to the ball joint properly. Take our knuckle and we'll put it right onto that lower ball joint. Take your ball joint nut, put it onto the ball joint stud. Now we're going to bottom this out and then we're going to torque it to manufacturer's specification. Now that we started the nut on there, we'll bottom this out and then we're going to torque this to 72 foot-pounds. The next thing we have to do is hold the knuckle still so we can continue torquing the ball joint without spinning on us. I'll use a nice long pry bar, come straight on through that wheel bearing hole. Mash this thing. Now let's continue with some copper never sees. We're going to come right along the back side of the wheel bearing. Try to spray it into the splined hole so when we put in the axle, we'll be sure to be able to get it out in the future if needed. Carefully grab that axle, slide it into the back here, and then put the knuckle into its proper position. We should see the axle coming out through the front. Now we'll turn the strut as needed so it lines up with the knuckle. Go ahead and slide that right into position. Once you have it lined up, continue on by putting in your mounting bolts. You'll notice that I cleaned the threads and I applied some red thread locker. Start on both of your mounting nuts. Bottom each of these out and then torque them to 97 foot-pounds. Let's continue on with some copper never sees along the mating surface of our bearing hub. Let's take our brake rotor and slide it onto the hub. Hold it in place with one of your lug nuts. Clean your caliper bracket mounting bolts, apply some red thread locker, and install your caliper with bracket. We'll slide that right on over the rotor here, start in both of our mounting bolts, snug them up, and then torque each of these to 65 foot-pounds. Move along the backside of your strut. We're going to get ready to remount our ABS wire and flex hose. Make sure you clean the mounting bolt and apply some copper never sees. For mounting this, you want to make sure you mount the ABS bracket first. Looking at the bottom, you can see you have a little mounting piton here, and then up along the top you have a hook. Let's slide the bottom into the groove along the bottom of the strut. Swing the top up and over, the hook should sit right into place, and the bolt hole should line up. After that, take the flex hose, slide it right on over, and then start in your mounting bolt. Make sure it's completely secured. Remount your ABS sensor. For the mounting bolt, you never want to use red thread locker. Only use copper never sees. Let's snug this. Right there, it feels like it bottomed out. Let's take it a teeny bit further, keeping in mind that you do not want to damage the ABS sensor in any way. Let's finish securing that ABS wire. Make sure it's completely secure and there's no way it can get hung up or caught on anything while you're driving down the road. Now we can go ahead and put in our outer tie rod end. Let's slide that up and into the knuckle. Once you have it in there, continue on by putting on your mounting nut. Now we'll bottom this out and then torque it to 36 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the hole that's in the tie rod stud. Also, pay attention to all the slots that are on the tie rod nut. You need to make sure that one of the slots lines up with the corresponding hole in the stud. If for some reason one is not, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Once you've got it in the proper placement, continue on with a brand new locking cotter pin. We'll slide that right on through. Peen it over. Then just peen this over so there's no way this nut can loosen up while you're driving down the road. Okay, the next thing you want to do is continue on to installing your axle nut. For the axle nut, make sure you go ahead and put it on here by hand and bottom it out. Once you have it bottomed out, bring your vehicle closer to the ground. You'll notice that I have a pry bar coming across some of my lug studs. I put it as flat as possible so I don't damage the studs. The reason why I have the bar here is to make sure that this does not spin on me while I continue torquing the axle nut. We'll torque the axle nut to 159 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, pay attention to the slot on the axle shaft itself. What you want to do is take a hammer and punch and peen the nut down into that slot. That's going to prevent this from loosening up on you while you're driving down the road. That looks good. Okay, so at this point, we're almost ready to put the wheel back on. But before you do, double check everything. Make sure your flex hose and your ABS wire are not twisted, they're not tangled, and they're definitely mounted properly. Also, double check to make sure you torqued everything. Assuming it looks good, let's grab the wheel and get ready for installation. Remove your lug nut. Let's get the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 4 of our lug nuts, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then torque all of the lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, let's continue torquing these to that 76 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Assuming you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. The area that you want to pay attention to for your hubcaps is the area for the valve stem. Line that up, put it in position up against the rim, and drive it in. Make sure it's secured all the way around so it doesn't fall off while you're driving down the road.